Well, a very good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Liz Moseley, and this is a Tortoise Thinking. For those of you who haven't been to a Thinking before, we call it a forum for civilized disagreement. We're here to kind of put our heads together and see if we can thrash out the beginnings of an answer to a question. And we really mean it when we say we want to hear what you think. We have got some extraordinary people in the room with us this evening who will help us to kind of get the conversation going. But the main people really we want to hear from are the people who are here to listen, to share their own experiences, ideas and thoughts and so on. So please don't be shy. Weigh in the chat. You can type away or you can put your little digital hand up, and I will do my best to bring in as many people as I can. To answer this question, the sort of rather funny question, really, the framing of it, what should social workers do? And I suppose there's a sort of ghost word at the end of that sentence, which is differently. What should social workers do differently? How can this system work? And this evening's thinking is a really special one, an exciting one for us at Tortoise, because it marks the return of an old friend, a former Tortoise editor, Polly Curtis, who began work on this here book. It's publication day today, behind closed doors. As many as, was it 4 years ago, Polly, that you started this journey? It's a long time.
No, it was 3 years ago. I just can't work out time because of the pandemic.
Time is meaningless now. But Polly, just to sort of get us going this evening and to set the scene, I remember very clearly when we started publishing, or your work in a case file was the old thing we used to call it, about the state versus the family, was the sort of framing of it. Would you mind just sort of giving us a bit of context? How did it start? How did we end up here? And sort of briefly, what have you found on that journey?
So it started in a room like this with experts like this. And by experts, I mean care experienced people, parents, lawyers, teachers, academics, and legal professionals, all putting their heads together and going, what's really going wrong here? And it really is, I hope, even though Tortoise bears no responsibility for the book now, it really is testimony to the slow style of Tortoise reporting that I have had the time and the space to really examine what's going on in this system. And it's a story that so often happens in the flash of a headline that scandalizes and moves people and changes the system. But to stand back and say, what's the bigger trend here, was really my task. And I guess what I found just to round that off, just to say a huge thank you to Tortoise and all the many editors there who have contributed to this project. So thank you. So what I found was this system where there are more children in the care system than ever before. So over 80,000 children in care at the last count. Now, that's not a problem. That's fine if we're absolutely sure that every one of those children is best placed in the care system, if their best life is going to be as a result of being in the care system. But what I also found was a huge consensus that people don't feel confident that that's true. They don't feel confident about the decisions that are made and that we're doing the best things for all of those children. There was one report that was done by a group of judges and legal experts that looked at that something like a third of the cases that come into court probably shouldn't have ever come to court. They should have been dealt with through proper family support and interventions much earlier to prevent us getting to that stage. But the opposite is also true. And that's the paradox in this story that's so hard to grasp. We still miss children like Arthur and Star, and the NSPCC say that around one child a week is killed at home, and many more children are suffering at home as well. So the paradox in this story that I found was that we are removing more children than ever, but we're still missing children and leaving others behind. So it's the wrong children in the wrong places. The explanation I heard from social workers who are, know the system best, and from the families who are subjected to it and the children, the explanation is that we have, over the last few years, really shifted the funding from early help into late intervention. So over the last 10 years, the local authority spending on early intervention has decreased by 46% to 1.9 million. Late intervention, taking children into care, has risen by 29% to 7.2 billion. So you can see that shift in spending over the last 10 years. There's lots of other factors underneath that are explored in the book, but we're focused on the solutions today. So one social worker messaged me just today when they saw the book, and I think really demonstrated what that meant. She said to me, the conflicts of being a social worker and not being able to work with families for them to build confidence and have the right support haunts me constantly. Something has to be done. So that social worker was saying, I don't have the time, capacity, or resources to do social work with families to help them to stay together. And that's what I think the scandal is. Not that children are being removed when there's no good reason in that moment. It's that we're not doing everything in our power as a state to keep families together earlier. So in terms of what social workers should do, there are, to that point, we need to give social workers the time, the resources, and the rewards to really focus on building relationships earlier so that they can help families to stay together safely, but also make those really difficult judgments more quickly to remove children when they're not safe. So I think it's all around giving social workers the resources and time and putting the focus on early intervention rather than coming to this situation really later. I'm going to throw out one really controversial idea that I cover in the book, because I think it will be good for the conversation here today. I spent time in New York looking at what's happened in New York, and I saw huge similarities in New York. The racism in the system is just breathtaking and shocking, but I saw huge similarities in the alienation that families feel here as well, and the lack of trust in the system. And there is an argument building amongst experts in America about abolishing social work and putting the funding into families, into communities, into a different way of working. So I examine that idea because I wonder if you were to split the workforce in the eyes of the public into a really strong family support system that also brought all the accountability for family support, so there was more focus on family support, and a smaller child protection team, you might start to repair the relationship between people and the system. Now, I know that's really controversial, and I'm not a policymaker, I have no power, but I raise the idea because I've seen that in some areas of the country, I can't quite see how we're going to repair the reputation and make it work better again. But the last thing I want to say, and this is just the very last thing I'll say because I'm hogging the time, is this isn't just about social workers. Social workers are at the sharpest end of this. They are at the front line of the whole system, but we need to reorganize society around families and make society family friendly. We need schools, health services, employers, welfare systems to be geared around making families a better place to be. And that means neighbours and communities as well.
Thanks ever so much, Polly. There's a lot in there in Polly's setup. If you've just joined as Polly was talking, I really do want to know what you think, particularly perhaps your responses to that last sort of big idea that Polly outlined. There's a lot in the book, which I've read most of it today, actually, that is thought-provoking, quotable, different, moving. The words that sort of stick with me is together, trust, there's a lot of talk about love, more than you might perhaps have expected of a book like this. And there's a particular quote that a social worker called Nigel Richardson, who's a sort of bit of a legend in the space, it would seem, who's done a load of reforming work in Leeds. And he had said that family is the most forgotten utility of the 21st century, which in itself is an interesting way of sort of framing some of this conversation. I'm going to bring in a person called Isabel Kirkwood now, who I know is here listening and watching and thinking, because Isabel, if you're there, hello, nice to see you. I spoke to you on the phone today, but I can see your face for the first time. Isabel, you are a care experienced person, right?
Yes, yeah, I grew up in foster care from 9, and I'm recently, I guess, deceased, officially a care leaver. I don't really like to call myself a care leaver. I tend to just go, I'm a care experienced person. But yeah, care experienced.
So our big question today is, what should social workers do kind of differently? And I'm interested to hear from you, just to get the ball rolling. If you think about your experience growing up, and the particular sort of point that we're interested in for the purposes of today's conversation is the bit that happens before, the bit before you're 9, the decision, and then you end up in foster care and you go through the care system. I mean, that is a whole nother thinking of its own. It's the lead up to that point. And if you think back to that time in your story, and the social workers that you came into contact with and what happened with you, what would you say now, as a sort of grown-up person, having had those experiences, what would you like them to have done differently in that period of time?
It's really simple. It's such a simple thing. It would have been to tell me what was going on. And I do think back to kind of 9-year-old me in comparison to 25-year-old me. I still don't know the exact reasons why I went into care, even at 25, even going through all of my files. And that generally comes down from my social workers, and I use social workers there because I had many young kind of care experienced people do. They didn't tell me what was going on. I didn't understand why I needed to be removed or why I had so many social workers kind of involved. I remember thinking actually quite a lot at kind of between 7 to 9, when social workers were constantly in my life, that every person in the world had a social worker. I thought my best friend had a social worker. I thought my classmates all had social workers. And I generally think that came down to a lack of communication from my social worker. So I think many things that social workers could do, and that comes from being in care myself. But in that before time, it would be communication, not just with the adults in that situation particularly, but the children themselves. And obviously it doesn't need to be in an adult-centered way, but actually talking to them about what on earth is going on, explaining why stuff is happening, why they have to have a social worker, why they have to have review meetings. It just goes a long way. And that has definitely come from my own experience from being 25 and still not having an absolute clue why half the reasons why things happened. And that's really difficult to kind of understand, that it would have probably taken a social worker an hour or two to sit down with me at 8, 9 and go, hello, Isabel, this is why this needs to happen. Let's talk about it, and then go through that process together.
What is your best guess as to why they didn't take that couple of hours to sit with 9-year-old Isabel and go, okay, so this is the thing?
A mixture of things. I think one, probably because their caseload, I'm going to be honest with you. I think it was that. I think timing. There was also 6 of us that kind of lived in my family home, so in terms of children, so that would have had to be like multiple conversations that they had, which I think would have just added again to their caseload, which is, I hate saying that that's why. I think all social workers want to do their best, but because of their lack of time to do that, to put that relationship in, I think that's all it is. I also think that they just didn't have a relationship with me either. They were in and out of my life, but they were more there for my, I guess, safety rather than my well-being and my
consistency and the way that you would build a relationship with a person rather than a job, if you like. It was a challenge too.
I think they were in my life so consistently that I thought it was a normal person to have in my life. But there was no relationship there at all. To be honest, I don't think I ever really had relationships with any of my many social workers that I had. My PAs are a different matter. I work quite hard to build them relationships with my personal advisors, but there was no relationship there at all, especially when I was so young as well. Like, just because I was a child doesn't mean I wouldn't have understood what was going on.
And it was happening to you at the end of the day. Thanks so much, Isabel. I can see the chat has really woken up already. There's some brilliant stuff going on in there. And Isabel, I might come back to you a bit later on, but I'm tempted to come to Beverly now if I can. Beverly-Barnett Jones. Now Beverly, you were social worker for 25 years, something like that. So you've been around the block a bit in the
I've been around the block quite a bit. I've been working with children and families since 1991, actually. So it's a good 30 plus years.
But we've heard from Polly, we've heard a snapshot of Isabel, and you've heard a gazillion of stories, like Isabel's and non-like Isabel's as well, and they're all different. As a social worker, with all those years of experience and all those thousands of families and kids that you've worked with, how do you think the work needs to change?
The work needs to change. I think how should the work change? I think we have to kind of put it in the context. Social work works in a system and operates and functions within a system of social care. So the activity of social work, which is about, why people go into it, which is to sort of support, help people with their lives, empower people to make changes, drivers around protecting children, all the things that are noble about going into social work are the things that is the reason why you become one. I think the difficulty happens in terms of the practice of social work and what happens within the system that it exists within. So really good things are happening within that system. I want to say that, and really good social work does happen. And there are many examples of the opposite to what Isabel identifies. But I think the difficulty we've had is acknowledging Isabel's story and other people's journeys when it's gone very wrong for them. And one of the things we have to do, I think, is kind of reflect on that and accept that the way that the work is being delivered, the way that the work is framed, can do harm and has done harm. So first of all, I think I would say that we have to sort of stop and think a bit and reflect a bit. That question that you put up there after, the death and the horrible deaths of these two children, what should social workers do? First thing we have to do is just stop and think again, because we stopped and thought when Peter died, we stopped and thought when Daniel died. But what I think we're a bit fearful of is what is going to be done to us in a way, because what we need is not another knee-jerk reaction into more regulation, more prescription, more kind of controlling of the activity of social work. What we need is social work to be freed up, I think, from some of the things that bind it into a system that can be oppressive and can sort of create relationships that are harmful. So I'm a bit fearful for social work and I'm hoping, that those who are going to do this national review are really minded that we can't afford another set of knee jerks and political kind of positioning, because it's just too important. We're at a critical juncture. Polly's book really shows that there is a real legitimacy question, there's a trust in the state question, but there is at the same time some beautiful things happening in the relationship between social workers in some areas and their communities and their families. And there is this kind of coming together, around a relational practice that is beyond what I practiced earlier in my days when I was in the community as a sort of patch social worker, and I knew my community really well. So I think for us, social work has to, hope that those in charge don't bring us back down another road of repeated lessons learned, because we know what the lessons are, and Polly articulated them. We need a system that gives us time, to build those deep relationships and to get to know children and families in their context. We need a system that's going to address the fundamental drivers of poverty and inequality. Yeah. Because as Paul shared with Polly again and again, it's the wallpaper of the practice, and it does have an intimate connection to how people function in their families. But we do need to recognise that we've got power, and how we use that power has to change. That we have to work along and with families. You've got Cathy here who can talk about family-led decision making. Yeah. And places like Leeds, places like Warsaw, other places are actually bringing about those kind of practices, relational practices. and changing the nature of the relationship between state and family. But for me, you know, I want to kind of big up to a social worker called James in Polly's book, because I think we need more Jameses. We need to be doing more of what James did as a social worker, you know, really kind of understanding his role, his authority, what his job was, which was to work out what is in the best interest of that young person, but to really work with that father, you know, in ways that were collaborative, you know, that were connecting, that created love. I'm going to put that word out there, and not be frightened of that, not to be frightened to share some of one's own experience with families, show that human face, show that kind of what I call critical, sort of compassionate practice, which means that you have to be challenging sometimes, you have to be sometimes really authoritative, but you do that in a sense that really recognises the dignity of other people. I've removed children from parents, you know, and it's an awful thing to do, but I've had that capacity to acknowledge that pain that I've created and continue to work with that parent for recovery and open up the opportunity of recovery. The law says it. We should look to see if families can look after their children first, but we should always look at whether they can be rehabilitated to their families as well. It's not the end of the story, but at the moment it seems to be we remove and we get the relief of removal, and then we go into processes of planning for children, which then sort of forget the importance of family. And when I mean family, I always say this, family is beyond the household that the child lives in. There were lots of people connected to children in their communities that could help to care. So we need to situate ourselves, I think, in that space. I hope I've answered your question, Liz. Well, I hope that's okay.
Oh no, brilliant. I've been making tons of notes there. I'm very interested in the first chunk of what Bev was talking about. She used this word fear, and I feel fearful for social work and social workers, and you do get a sense of that in Polly's book, and indeed we had a think-in about 6 months ago now, I think it was, with Sharon Shoesmith, who was that people will remember was the Director of Children's Services at Haringey Council when Peter Connelly was killed, and we talked a lot about fear and blame in that conversation too, and it's quite palpable in some of the stories in the book. I do want to talk to Cathy in a second, but I'm tempted to bring in a couple of people who've been making great points in the chat just so we can hear everybody. Maybe Kate Blackburn has made a comment. I'd love to hear from Kate if she's there, and Angela Clark perhaps as well. Kate, are you available?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah, hiya.
What are you thinking about all this, Kate? What's your situation?
So I'll try and move this a minute. Hang on. Oh, hang on a minute. I've lost you now again. Hang on a minute. How do I do this?
We can
Can you hear me? So my situation is we went through years of domestic abuse, and I was desperate for help, crying out for help through lots of different agencies.
Oh, Kate's
obviously damage was done.
Sorry, Kate.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Keep losing you. You're a bit sort of patchy, come and go. You might need to go back out.
Oh, hang on. Let me move. Let me move.
We'll come back to you, Kate. Go and reposition yourself, and we'll come find you in a minute. Angela Clark, are you there? We'll see if the Wi-Fi is kinder to us in Angela's house. Hi, Angela.
I'll give it a go. Can't guarantee it. You know how these things are.
Exactly.
Yeah, so much of what everybody's said already has really resonated with me. I've worked for a long time as a social worker and a leader of social work practice in England. I think we've really gone astray in terms of the original intentions of the Children Act 1989, which is about providing the help that families need under Section 17 in order to allow them to safely care for their children. And far too many children are pushed into oppressive, or families rather, are pushed into oppressive social work practice to put children on child protection plans, to threaten them with removal if they don't do this, that or the other, telling people what to do instead of taking an empathic approach to understanding their needs and providing that help. And I'm biased because I work for the Centre for Family Safeguarding Practice, but I think with our model, when we get that right, when we have the right approach, the right people in the room, the right people providing help, we make better decisions, and families are more grateful for our intervention rather than feeling done to.
Yeah, that's the distinction between social work being something that's sort of imposed upon you, as opposed to a sort of way of supporting and nurturing, and yes, holding accountable for responsibilities, but in a sort of way that is encouraging and pointing in the right direction, rather than a sort of punitive, lamey kind of threatening way. I'd love to understand better that phrase that Bev used, relational practice, I think it was. If Tim Fisher is here, he is one that has a chapter in the book, and I know he's sort of using that practice. I'd love to understand a little bit more how that works, but perhaps Claire Laxton might want to come on and sort of chime in with some observations before we go to Tim, and then I'm going to go to Cathy. Hi, Claire.
Hello. Hi. Apologies if you can hear my dog snoring in the background, but
it's not thinking if there's no dogs, so you're all good.
I just really resonate with what Bev was saying as well, in terms of thinking about a family approach. I work for an organisation that supports women that have had children removed more than once, and it's so often that those children are removed and then that parent is left to just get on with whatever they need to get on with, and that, you know, that complex trauma that they've often lived through is really unresolved. And you know, 40% of the women that we work with have grown up in care themselves, so you see that corporate parented, corporately grandparented, great grandparented, the system isn't working if that's happening. And I think it's that family approach that Bev was talking about that is about safeguarding children, but also understanding some of those reasons and really addressing some of that complex trauma that happens in families to stop it happening again. And I think that's really important, and I don't think we've got it right consistently.
There definitely feels to be something about the bit that happens afterwards, the sort of it's never going to be a soft landing, because it's a terrible and difficult thing in any scenario, but there feels to be something about the aftercare part for the parent and the child that's a sort of not quite a hole exactly, but it's sort of underdone somehow in the way that the provisions are designed at the moment. Thanks ever so much, Claire. Please, if you work for organisations that might be useful, people, don't be shy. You stick links in the chat and share resources. That's all good. Perhaps we'll come to Cathy if we can. Cathy Ashley, you're CEO of the Family Rights Group, and you, as an organisation, support families who are involved with social services in whatever way that they might be. What would a better social work system feel like for the families that you're working with?
Well, I think one of the things is understanding why they're engaged with the system. We're seeing, particularly during the pandemic, child protection conferences happening, which remotely, sometimes with parents expected to just contribute by phone, often not understanding why children's services are concerned, what they can do to contribute to that child protection plan. And there has been a doubling in the number of families subject to child protection inquiries over the last 10 years. And so the question that raises is, does that mean that abuse has doubled in the last 10 years, or is it the way that we are responding to crises and concerns within the family? And I particularly want to highlight domestic abuse, because that is the most common factor when families contact our advice line as to why children's services are involved. And that has shifted quite significantly over the last 10 years. So we're seeing a system where often mothers who are subject, obviously it's not exclusively mothers, but it often is women who are subject to domestic abuse, are then deemed to have failed to protect their children from the abuser, and the system then feels incredibly oppressive. And when you add another layer onto that, which is the point that Claire's made, which is if you're looking at whose children is being removed, it's often very young women, it's often women who themselves were in the care system. So to me, there's a question of, if we judge our child welfare system on the basis of how does it fare for young parents who are themselves in care and for parents who are subject to domestic abuse? The answer is it's incredibly oppressive at the moment. And there are things that we can do to shift that. There are approaches such as family group conferences. One of the reasons I don't quite agree with Polly in terms of the solution she highlights about separating out the social work profession is because actually partnership with family and trust and engagement needs to run through all the way from early support, and it includes within the child protection system, and it includes even where a child may need to be removed. You have got to work with the family. And my fear is that if we separate out, all we'll end up is with an even more punitive investigative system than we have now. So, but I know that Kate was trying to contribute earlier, and I know that her experiences resonate with what I've said, because she's a part of the Family Rights Group's parents panel.
Thanks ever so much, Cathy. Let's try and get Kate back in if we've got a happier Wi-Fi scenario. Kate Blackburn, hello, I can see you waving at me.
Hiya, hopefully that's better now. Can you hear me? Is that better?
I can hear you.
Yeah. So as I explained, I'd gone through years of domestic abuse. I'd spent years trying to get away. I worked with Women's Aid for 4 years, I think, before I actually managed to get away from the perpetrator. By that point, my children, I had 5 children, they were all pretty damaged because it was not just abuse to me, it was abuse to them as well. I'd been crying out for help, but in a quiet way, because the perpetrator told me that I'd lose my children, so I was terrified of losing my children, so I would try and hide it by saying that you know, I didn't know why their behaviour was as it was, because the children were struggling at school. Suffice to say, when I left, I gave a big report to the police, and we went through that system, but social services came and did an assessment and said, no, it's fine, she's managing fine. The police would contact social services and said, I've been to visit, that's not fine, I'm really concerned about one of the children in particular there. And this got battered to and from between services for a good couple of years, until it got to the point that my 9-year-old was being so violent towards me and his siblings and smashing up everything in my house, was absconding from school, being restrained on a regular basis, and nobody knew what to do. Even the local CAMS was like, never seen a child like this before, don't know what to do. And I got so fed up of nobody actually helping that in the end I asked Women's Aid to call a strategy meeting, which she did, and I said that I wanted to take my own children to child protection because I couldn't protect them anymore. So I took them to child protection meeting. It was agreed. I invited every single person that worked with us over the period of years. I think there's about 20 people in that first ICPC. And the IRO said to me, I'm not really sure whether you understand that you can lose your children at this point. And I said, oh no, I realise that, but I don't have an alternative. And she said, right, so you're crying out for help? And I said, yeah. And she said, we're not meant to use this as a cry for help. And I said, I haven't got an alternative, because if I don't bring them to you, you're going to take them away from me anyway, because something's going to happen and one of my children is going to be responsible, and it's not going to be their fault. So suffice to say, all the professionals gave their numbers to how much of a danger they were, and 1 was the lowest, and everyone in that room rated my son as a 1. The IRO asked everyone to apologise to me, which just asked them to look at me and say, you know, basically look at what's happened, what this parent's had to do. She said we should be removing him at this point, and the other children as well, but we're not going to. We're going to put support in place straight away. So from that day, I had support. I had 2-to-1 mental health support for my son, and then the idea was that he then went into residential, which is where he is now. But I have full PR. He's on a Section 20, but he shouldn't be there, and he's got to live with that for the rest of his life, and I have to live with it as his mum. I now do advocacy for, well, we're starting doing advocacy for my local authority, who are very engaged in lived experience and trying to learn from things that have happened to people. And I genuinely believe that however much people think that you know, things are intergenerational and all the things, but if people don't get the support, it will be intergenerational, because they don't know any different. So this is why things like family group conference and things are imperative, to actually get the cohesion for a family. A family is the whole lot.
Yeah.
It's not just blood, it's
Yeah.
everything. And I think that it's really key. Lifelong links, the same thing for children that are in care. It's huge.
Yeah.
But early intervention, I'm unfortunately a huge believer that it goes quite wrong in schools. That's my experience, is that schools are where it went majorly wrong. That's not their fault. It's because they've got so much pressure on them for results.
Set up to do something different.
100%,
Thanks ever so much, Kate. I'm so pleased that the Wi-Fi worked in the end as well, so we could get to hear your very important story. I would like to speak to Tim, if he is around, Tim Fisher, just to sort of make sure we've properly understood. Hi, Tim.
Hiya, you're right.
You star in a chapter in the book as well, and you were a social worker in Camden, right?
Yeah, I am, and I liked Polly's description of a meeting that took place in Kentish Town, where we went and met a lot of people in the community, and we were going round and in the traditional way saying who we all were, and I said I was a social worker, and I was sort of roundly booed by the people there, but you know, it led to a conversation, an interesting conversation. I think when people talk about well, we shouldn't do two, we should work with people. I agree with that, but I think, you know, there's another level perhaps, I mean, that, you know, about being there and being there for people and helping. We can't have a relationship or, you know, use words like buzzwords like relational if we're not with people, if we're not in the community, and not in the community with the risk goggles and the blue light, you know, in the community, learning from people. And what Kate was just saying about advocacy, family good conference, you know, these are methods for blending lived and learned experience for professionals genuinely learning from others and coming to solutions together. So if there is a redesign of the system, and I mean, I would be up for that. It needs to be a big co-design with the community and with people and families nationally. Yeah. Well, I thought, and that little idea about relational activism came from parents in Camden that started saying, you know, we're actually not minded to wave placards outside the courts, although some do, and I respect that. But you know, we do want to make a difference and influence the part of the system that's around us, the part of the system that we can reach. And so they developed this term of relational activists, and then and to love is to act is another way of phrasing that. And I thought Polly is a real relational activist in the way that she works and the way that she wrote the book, because she got behind the closed doors and she had the gumption to go and meet with people and really meet them on a level and learn from them. And I thought that was what was really wonderful when I read the book.
Tim, it's a sort of two-part question in a way. Firstly, you're obviously doing good and interesting, I think, effective work in Camden. Are you unusual in the sort of social workers that are around and about, either in the way you do it, or I don't know, your disposition, I suppose, your profession is sort of part one, and then the second part, which is related to that, which is how do you have enough equipment, resources? Like, how difficult is it to do your work in the way that you do it?
Well, I think when you've got good people around, and we've got Maria on the call and Clarissa, and that when you've got good people, then you can work more cooperatively, and when you've got the relationships. And so certainly any one individual in Camden, I don't think is necessarily special. There's a special community in Camden, you know, the Camden Village, which is strong. But I do really support methods, you know, family rights group, an excellent organisation. Methods like Family Group Conference and Parent Advocacy, which PFAN and people like Talia, Andy Bilson are developing, Parent Advocacy nationally. So I think there are methods there that others can use and learn. We can learn from each other. So I'd be hopeful that it isn't just about, you know, a special hippie lovey-dovey thing in London, although I'm sure there is a bit of that about it.
Yeah, that too. All right, thanks ever so much, Tim. It's lovely to see you. Having read about you today, I feel like I'm, you know, meeting my heroes. I'm tempted to bring in, I know you mentioned Clarissa, I can see her in the chat too. I'm tempted to have, before I come to Rachel Souza, the Children's Commissioner for England, is here. I sort of thought I'll let Rachel sort of listen to what's being said, and then we can perhaps respond a little bit to it. I'm just tempted to talk to Angela FraserWix, because I know she's here in the room and is chair of the Family Rights Group. Hi, Angela. Oh, let's unmute Angela so we can hear what she's got to say. Are we able to? There we go.
Sorry, every time you tried, I tried. It didn't work very well. Exactly. Good evening. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for being here. So we've sort of done a fair amount of chat. What are your reflections on it? As you're chair of Family Rights Group now, your care experience yourself, what are you thinking about all this?
Well, I've just been, if I'm honest, I've been thoroughly enjoying the conversation and reading the chat and hearing everybody's different points of view. I think it's brilliant to get everybody together to have this discussion. I think for me, what I was taking away from this was, you know, I've been working with a group of birth mums recently, doing quite a lot of work. And they've highlighted to me that what they really think we need to see in practice is what I've sort of become referring to as the 3 T's, because it's time and timeliness. So it's the time spent with families, but it's also spending time with them at the right time in their lives. So when they actually need that help and need that support. Transparency. So, you know, being honest and open about what the problems are, what both sides are expected to do to solve these problems, and how they can both work together, which links quite nicely into a document that Family Rights Group prepared in collaboration with practitioners and families, called the Mutual Expectations Charter, which is exactly that, an agreement between both sides. But then it's also trust. And without the time and the transparency, there can't be the trust. And if we are, especially those of us like myself who were domestic abuse victims, if we are to ever build a relationship of trust with the social worker that we're working with, who we rely on this social worker to help us, to save us, to get us out of the situation that we're in. And we're being forced by a perpetrator to do as they say. We can't be forced by a social worker. We need time. We need that trust to build that relationship. And then we can start to see, actually, this person has the potential to help. This person cares. And then we can begin to listen. But if we are faced between making the decision of listening to the perpetrator, who we live with and who we could be in fear of our life from, or a social worker who we maybe see once a week, it's a foregone conclusion that we are going to end up listening to the person that is controlling our lives. So it is very much about that. Time is crucial. We can't build a relationship, none of us can, and we're expecting families to discuss very deeply traumatizing events in their lives, whether it be from their childhood or abuse they've suffered later in life. But we're not putting in any provision to support that person to deal with the fact that this traumatizing and triggering information has been shared. And then we're labeling and judging when this person is then not able to cope with these emotions that have surfaced. So we're sort of, it very much feels like we're often setting families up to fail. And then to go back to that question earlier about family, what is family? Family is whoever the child deems to be family, whoever that unit decides is family. My daughter has umpteen people in her life that she's not any blood relation to, but they are her family. They love her, they support her, they care for her. And should anything happen to myself or my husband, I have no doubt that they would be there to step in. And again, that's another issue, is about the whole family being seen as a means of support, not just to help with problems, but further down the line, if children can't remain at home. And then we get into the realms of kinship care, and how we really need to be seeing that as a first thought and not an afterthought. But that's just my initial thinkings of what I've heard.
It's lovely to see you, Angela. Thanks so much. I'm going to come to Rachel de Souza, because the time has flown. It's already nearly 7:20 and I didn't realise. Rachel de Souza, hello, thank you so much. And I'm sorry you've listened patiently as we've garbled on. You're the Children's Commissioner for England. You were a head teacher. I wonder, in your job, what children that you speak to and hear from need from social workers most?
No, that's such a fantastic question, but I just want to start really by saying first of all, thank you everyone who's shared. My own mother was care experienced and in a orphanage in the 40s till she was 7, and the questions Isabel's asking, she's still asking at 76. It's funny, these things come around. So the thing I did is when I became Children's Commissioner in March was do a survey of England's children, and we got about 500,000 responses. But in those 500,000 responses, there were 6,000 children in care. And those children, so it was really interesting. So we talk to lots of care leavers in my office. I travel around, I'm talking to individuals, but that 6,000 voices were really powerful. And what did they tell us? They told us that they wanted exactly the same things as all other children want. And it was really clear. It was, a loving family, or at least some consistent relationships that are like family, a stable home, not to be moved, and a home, good friendships. They want a good school life, good places to go, things to do, fantastic jobs in the future. Interestingly, the children in care were less likely to be happy. So about 80% of the whole cohort was said, of that 500,000, said they were happy or fine. It was about 50%. And there was a real split for children. Again, there was a real split between children who were having a good experience and they were really grateful for it, it was great, and those who really the system was letting down. But when we get to the bottom of it, I think the strong message, and it's a message that's come over time, was that it's all about relationships. And that's why I love Polly's book. I want to just, really her warmth and her I really want to congratulate her approach, focusing on those at the central of social care, and you've illuminated it with real tact and warmth. So back to those relationships, then that's where we get to the problem, isn't it? If there are 80,000 children in care at one time and 500,000 children who receive social care in some form, at any time, that means hundreds of thousands of relationships which have to be formed and sustained in the most challenging circumstances. So when we talk about the future of social work, I want it to be one that can really focus on relationships, and one that empowers all those in social care to develop those relationships. And I think that's come out loud and clear. And that's not just about social workers. I was in Plymouth recently with a group of care leavers, and they were talking to me about how important their key relationship with their youth workers were. For others, it's advocates, maybe a teacher. For families, it might be a key worker. But the difficulty is, when we're trying to build a system, I want a system that builds around these relationships, but we're working with such complexity. So I've got a help at hand service. So we talk to work with and intervene in some of the most serious cases. And I just wanted to talk to you about one, which is Tom. So Tom's an older teenager. He's been in care for many years, suffered trauma, abuse, exploitation. He's been in regulated and unregulated placements and secure placements all across the country. And he right now is in the middle of an unedifying fight between the local authority and the NHS as to whether his self-harming, which is extreme, meets the threshold for admission to hospital. My office, the High Court, the CCG, the Trust, NHS England, the CQC, Ofsted, everyone's involved. Yet nobody can find a placement that's right for Tom. And there have been meetings about him for months, sometimes daily, and we're back and forward at court at the moment. Yet when I pull everyone together, all those parties, all the chief execs, we get into this sort of abstract discussion about different specifications with little reference to how they're responding to Tom's like daily needs. The one person who knows Tom is his advocate. He can tell my office how Tom's feeling, that he's scared to go back to his strange flat that the LA are renting for him with strange staff. It's the advocate who makes sure there's some money in the flat so Tom can get a takeaway. And it's the advocate who goes out and finds out where he is, takes him for a walk, brings him a bag of food, you know, goes round to his sisters to find him. He's got a dedicated team of 6 here. It's only one person who thinks, where is he now? What does he want? So, you know, the system can't find a solution to Tom because they're not answering those questions at the very really human level. And I mean, the more removed you are from a child, the easier it is to forget the individual child instead of seeing the sort of issues that have got to be managed. So for me, it's 4 things, and then I'll stop. It's children should be listened to and responded to. Children should have relationships that are trusting and stable. They should feel loved, supported and stable. And children and families must be able to access practical help and support. And that might sound like it's stating the absolute obvious, but where I see failure, and I see lots of it, it's because those 4 things are missing. So I think relationships and those very, you know, straightforward 4 things would take us a heck of a long way.
Thanks ever so much, Rachel. I want to ask a follow-up question, if I may. We've heard from Bev and from others and in the chat about pockets of best practice, really brilliant work happening that's really making a difference. And
I've seen it, Liz.
A great social worker working with her son now, and that's been brilliant for the last 4 years. So what does it take to turn pockets into comprehensive and then the sort of instances where it isn't working are in sort of the pockets rather than the other way around?
Right, so that's a brilliant question, and I've seen brilliant practice, and I want to be optimistic and say, you know, I've been to Leeds, I've talked about great practice in Kirklees, I've been all around and seen fantastic things. I think a couple of things. I think the difficulty is that social care, I think, needs to be locally configured, agile, relationship-based, grounded in communities. So it's very hard to cookie cut and scale. It has to be that. But I think for me, the word would be culture. I think where we manage to scale in places like Leeds and other places where you see outstanding practice, they've really worked on cultures rather than obsessing about structures. Because at the bottom, if it's about relationships, then it's going to be cultures, learning, open, you know, able to, you know, let's stop talking about thresholds, let's start having conversations about the child or the family. Let's trust each other as professionals. Let's invest in proper conversations. CPD, managers, leaders, support your social workers, give them time. I mean, and those are the features of really outstanding provision. So I think developing the culture is what happens. We're about to have a care review, and brilliant Josh McAllister's doing that. And for me, let's get that care review done, but then it's going to take us a good few years to build the cultures that need to come from what the structures and the systems might need to change, but because it's relationship based. So, and it's about people.
Thanks ever so much, Rachel. There's the last 4 minutes. And I haven't done justice to the chat. There's been tons of stuff that I would have liked to have heard more from, and well done to my colleague Nimo for sort of fielding as much of that as you can. It was one of those ones where it goes really, really quickly. Is Bev still here? If she is, I'd love to just come back to Bev and ask a really quick sort of final thought. Hiya, Bev.
Hi. That's absolutely brilliant set of contributions and discussion. Honestly, I've been really taken in, been brilliant.
I know, I need my pen's nearly running out because I've written so many notes. Bev, this is a sort of funny question perhaps to end on, but I wonder, would you, if a sort of 21-year-old Bev were to approach you saying, I'm going to be a social worker, would you advise that person to go into that career? What would you say to her?
I would say yes, for sure. I would have no doubt in saying yes. What I would advise her is to listen deeply, because you learn actually from the families you work with first, to be honest. I would say the importance of evidence, research, and learning and continuous learning is something which she should embark upon and stick with throughout the whole of her social work career, because there's so much that's changed in our understanding of the impact of different harms and environments around children. There's so much to understand about the intersections of race and class and gender. There's so much to understand about all sorts. So I would say to that young Bev, you know, go in there with the same optimism that you still have 31 years later, that change is possible and that people can transform themselves and families and communities can transform themselves. And, you know, stay humble, stay really humble as a practitioner, because actually, you know, as I reflect back, the really difficult decisions that I've made, the forgiveness that I've had from families when I've actually said, you know, I've said to families, I've said to mothers, you know, the baby's not coming back. We've tried so hard, we've worked so hard, but it's not going to happen. And that mother coming back 6 months later and wanting to have a cup of tea, wanted to talk to me, wanted to understand, where did it go wrong, Bev? What do I need to do? When they're ready, you know, we were offering and we're able to run services that I managed that offered that continued sense of recovery. So it's that belief that people can change. So I would say come into it, because it's noble, you know, it's a vocation, you know, and I've seen people come into it without that vocational drive and get burnt out by it, get disappointed because they're trying to do all sorts of things that isn't possible within the practice. But, you know, yeah, it's a profession too, you know, and it needs investment, it needs care, you know, and I like what Rachel was saying there, it needs leadership and cultures that allow, as I said, the Jameses to flourish, the Tims to flourish, you know, they're invigorating around the practices and the way that they're working. You know, I'm many years older than them, but, you know, they fire me up. There's that passion around the belief that change is possible for and transformation is possible for social work practice is still there. So I will tell that 21-year-old, don't be naive, but she wasn't at 21 because she already had 2 kids by then. So she wasn't naive, but, you know, recognize that it's complex and that, you know, there are things you can do. But, you know, you're not a machine learner that can do predictives, and families are just human beings and move in all sorts of ways. And some of the times you're not going to get it. You're not going to understand it, and you're going to make mistakes. Yeah. But you have to be able to be strong enough to reflect on those and accept those as you go along. Yeah.
Thanks ever so much, Bev, to Big Bev and Little Bev, both present this evening, and to everybody who has contributed. There are 3 questions that I try to sort of hold in my mind when I'm doing a thinking, particularly about a topic like this, about which I know next to nothing, and I'm sort of trying to reach and to try and be helpful as best I can. One is what is true, the second one is what is important, and the third one is what is to be done. I think what we've heard this evening, and thank you very much to everybody who's contributed, the people who we know were coming, the people who I just kind of hoiked in as we went along. Polly spent 3 years figuring out what is true, what is important, and what is to be done. And there are some ideas there in the book that she's sort of gathered from listening deeply, I think, to people who have all manner of experiences relating to this. It's hard to imagine a more important and difficult job than what social workers have to do, particularly in that moment when you're making a call like that. What we've heard this evening, I think, are some really encouraging signs. As Bev says, it's not just that people can and do change, but systems also can and do change. We can't be naive about it because resources are critical. There are other things outside of social work that are totally critical. It's not an easy thing to unpick and unwind. But we will look to the National Review with great interest. I think it's coming in June, and in the meantime I hope that people will have a read of the book, whether you're in it or whether you're not in it. And I don't mean literally in the book, I mean in the world of social work and care. It's a really, really, really fascinating and thought-provoking thing that's made me think about my family in a really different way. So thank you very much to everybody for your time this evening. If you're not a member of Tortoise, we would love for you to join. And thank you to everybody for their amazing contributions. This thing, it will be on our website, and you can share it with anybody else who you think might be interested to watch it back. Thank you very much. Congratulations to Polly. Have a lovely rest of the evening. I've been Liz. Thanks so much. Bye.